Good morning. Let me introduce my panel to you quickly. To my immediate left is Ann Swanson. She is an attorney with the Washington office of Wilkinson, Barker, Knauer, with broad experience in communications law. In recent years, she has emerged as a legal and regulatory authority on media drones, or drones of all kind.
Drones of all kind.
Drones of all kind. And we are fortunate to have her expertise with us today. As chief UAS pilot at the Sinclair Broadcast Group, Jeff Rose, in the middle there, has staked out a leadership position for Sinclair in drones by equipping stations in 34 markets and training 80 videographers to operate them. Are those numbers correct, sir? Okay. And finally, John Ollwerther. He is vice president of media at Measure, a for-hire drones services company based in Washington. In addition to media, it makes crews available for all kinds of industrial jobs, from construction to energy to agriculture. It's also involved in training companies that want to keep their drone operations in-house. I guess I'm going to start with Ann. She is our attorney, and if you want to do this, you have to know what the rules are, and there's plenty of rules. And what are the rules as we sit here today?
Well, I come at this from having started my career as a communications lawyer 40 years ago, and I thought that field was highly regulated. Aviation is much more highly regulated, and I've been doing this for 6 years. I initially had to learn the rules for manned aviation in order to be a good unmanned aviation attorney. I'd like to know my audience a little bit. How many of you all, by any chance, have taken the remote pilot exam under Part 107? How many have applied for Part 107 waivers? And how many have met in person or talked over the phone with the FAA's UAS integration office? Okay, thank you, that helps. Part 107 has been in effect for about 16 months now. Took us a long time to get there. The basic premise of 107 is that you can go ahead and fly. You don't need an advance FAA approval as long as you conform to certain operational requirements. And before we had 107, before it became effective in August of 2016, my clients always had to go into the FAA and get an authorization, get a piece of paper before they could fly drones commercially. Initially, all we could get were what were called Special Airworthiness Certificates Experimental, or SACEs, and those were extremely limited in the drone context. We could only do R&D or crew training or marketing. We couldn't really fly commercial missions. And then in 2014, I led a group of lawyers at my former firm, Cooley, and on behalf of 7 different movie producers, we got the first what were called Section 333 authorizations for drones to fly commercially. But again, that was a lengthy process. I was talking to one of my panelists about that and how expensive it was and the documents we had to put in. So when we finally got to 107 16 months ago and no longer had to put in an advance application before we could fly, that was a big step. But as you'll hear from these guys at the same time, the rules are pretty limited in terms of what you can do operationally. You can't fly beyond visual line of sight. You can't fly over non-participating people. You can't fly at night. You can't fly multiple craft. You can't fly higher than 400 feet. You must be in uncontrolled Class G airspace. There are a number of different restrictions. But at the same time, the rule sets up and it lists 9 of those restrictions for which you can apply for waivers. And the FAA has been very active. Some people are complaining they're going too slow, but I think in the last 16 months they've been pretty active. As of last weekend, they'd issued 1,401 waivers. And the most commonly waived requirement was the requirement that you fly during the daytime. They've allowed 1,241 applicants to start flying at night, provided they use an appropriate craft that has anti-collision lighting that's visible 3 miles away. Second most common category are airspace waivers. They've issued 129 of those. And then the third most common, they've issued 22 for flying multiple craft. There have only been 10 waivers so far to allow parties to fly beyond visual line of sight, and there have only been 10 waivers to allow operations over people.
Okay, so where do we go from here? What's happening in Washington or the FAA that's going to lift some of these restrictions so we don't have to get waivers for some of these things? If they've granted 1,200 waivers for nighttime use, might they just say, oh, go ahead and go nighttime?
I wish it were that easy. When you apply for a waiver, you have to put in the concept of operations and you have to put in an operational risk assessment. Those are 5% legal and 25% technical. The FAA staff really takes safety seriously, and until they make sure the operational risks have been mitigated, they aren't going to grant your waiver. There's a lot going on, and I think three things I just want to call to your attention. Some of you all may have heard about a pilot program that the White House announced the end of October. We got the documents on it the beginning of November, and that's kicking off now. That came out of two forces within the Beltway. One was that state and localities, from their work on the Hill and the work with the FAA, were very concerned that they weren't involved in regulating drones. They've made a big pitch. I'm a strong proponent of preemption. I really would prefer not to have them involved. I don't want a patchwork quilt of regulations, but the state and local folks really wanted to be involved and were complaining to the White House. And secondly, there were a number of drone operators that were also complaining that the FAA wasn't going far enough. So the White House, working through DOT and the FAA, came up with a pilot program. Its main purpose is to collect data on state and local regulation, but it's going to do that by selecting public-private partnerships led by a state or local entity, but involving a lot of private companies. And those companies are going to be given special tickets, special accelerated opportunities to do some of these expanded operations. Those groups are being put together now. Public lead applicants had to let the government know by November 28th they were doing it. They have to let the government know who their private parties are by January 4th. And then there's an interested list of private parties. I kind of call it a dating website where private parties have to register, I think by tomorrow, in order to indicate that they're interested, and maybe the public folks will choose folks from that website to work with them. So far, I'm not seeing that. I mean, the public entities I know are putting together their own specialized teams. But we're going to see some expanded operations come out of that. Second area where I'd love to see more reform is flying beyond visual line of sight. And as my co-panelists probably know, the FAA had actually drafted proposed rules on allowing you to go beyond visual line of sight in the last administration. But when they circulated those proposed rules to other federal agencies, the law enforcement agencies were very concerned. They said the remote ID and authentication technology did not yet exist and wasn't sufficiently developed to the point where they felt comfortable letting drones go beyond visual line of sight, even under waivers. So the FAA commissioned earlier this year what's called an Aviation Rulemaking Committee. Unlike the FCC, when the FAA wants to do rules, it frequently sets up these groups of private-public parties to talk about the rules and prepare a report and turn it into the agency. That was turned in at the end of September, I believe. Actually, it was a little delayed. Got in there in October. The report exists now. There have been some non-public briefings, and that report will come out hopefully by the end of the year, and that will lay the predicate or the next step for the FAA going back and looking at its proposed rules for going beyond visual line of sight and hopefully getting that out in the first or second quarter. The other place I'd love to see reform is in allowing drones to fly over people. And the FAA, again, commissioned an aviation rulemaking committee back in 2016 to study this. It was called the Micro UAS Report. That report was filed in April of 2016, had some good recommendations, broke drones into 4 different categories, going from very tiny drones to big drones, and suggested different rules. That report is public, but so far it hasn't been implemented, and I'm hoping again in 2018 we'll see movement on that issue.
Jeff, would you give me a few examples of, given all these restrictions, and we saw some examples, but give us some more examples of where you can use this every day within the bounds of the current.
Or maybe where you can't.
Well.
Sure, well, we're limited to, obviously, you can't fly over people, so that means we can't fly over a road that's
Can you talk about that video and how you did that? Yeah.
The highway that was opening there, we had permission to be on the highway, and we were the only ones on the highway. And when you see the drone at the end go up and toward the other road, it never crossed that other road. And if you know the backstory, the pilots are all the way back down the highway looking straight down the line so they can see where they are in relation to the road. So we don't cross roads, that kind of thing. But there's plenty of ways to cover stories. And so, there's plenty of stories to be covered. If it's a solar farm in Virginia that was just opened up, what better way to get up high and show that? And we've showed downtown parades. We've shown in any kind of story, but you have to find a safe place to launch and recover, and you have to find a safe place to fly over, be it a building or woods or a pavilion or something like that. The FAA, Earl Lawrence has said that, Office of Immigration has said that people who are covered by something are considered to be protected. So we are specific with our drones in that we look at a Google Earth image, satellite terrain image, so that if we fly over there and try to stay over a building, we can look from above to see exactly where we are, so we don't go across the building and be over people. So if I'm hearing you, if you have like sort of an oblique angle, the rule is you can't be literally above the people, but you can shoot sort of at an angle and get in and be in, like shoot a crowd that's 400 feet away. Two things. The best shots are horizontal anyway. If you're looking straight down at something, it's not as good a view as the intimate straight-on shot, low, treetop level, what have you. The other thing is the FAA makes this rule very vague, and they leave it up to the pilot in command. You cannot fly over people. I don't say what that is, but we teach people, our pilots, that, for instance, if the wind is blowing this way and the drone is over there, I might still be over people when it comes down. The intent is when it comes down, you can't hit anyone.
John, your comments on that? What?
Yeah, there are certain events that the FAA says you can never fly a drone over, certain sporting events, that type of thing.
John?
Yeah, I would say in addition to Jeff's comments, one thing that Jeff's video shows well, and one thing that we really train our people to do well, is take advantage of long glass. That's your friend, and it tends to be more beautiful than what a lot of the public is already accustomed to, which is sort of the very wide drone shot. If you can get tight and introduce some movement and parallax into a shot, it tends to really draw viewers' eyes right to the screen. And furthermore, just to hit home with what Jeff was saying, yes, if a drone hits someone in the head after it falls, it was decidedly above their head. So I think, flying over someone's head directly above, yes, that's illegal. But at the end of the day, if you injure somebody, you were inherently above them.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, Ann. Has anybody been hurt by one of these things? Have there been lawsuits, and have there been fines? Have there been penalties handed out by the FAA or any other government agencies because of drones? And what's the history?
We are
of that?
so lucky in this country we've not had a drone fatality or a fatality caused by a drone, and the whole industry kind of lives in fear of that. So responsible operators like Measure and Sinclair want to make sure that we never get that event, because we only can fear the regulation that'll come down on us after that. Right now it is a risk-based or safety-based approach, even in flying over people. Your pilots make an assessment, and they're typically very well-trained pilots, and the FAA accepts their assessment, and we want to stay there. I divide the FAA enforcement of drones into two categories: before 107, where we saw some very highly publicized cases, and post 107. Before 107, we had a fine as high as $1.9 million for one company that was flying over Chicago and New York and taking video and doing other operations before it had a Section 333. Post 107, and I work a lot with the attorney who's in charge of enforcement in this country for UAS operations. He and I were on a panel last week, and I double-checked with him. There have been roughly 20 enforcement cases involving UAS so far. The FAA in the first case will always try, the first step will always try to engage in education. I mean, if they find somebody who's non-compliant, their folks out in the field are going to try and make sure that person understands what they're doing, bring them back to compliance, and frankly, you won't see a fine or a penalty in those cases. In the 20 cases to date, or roughly 20, most of them involved folks flying commercial operations without a remote pilot authorization, and a couple have involved operational restrictions. And there are some established FAA fines if you do have a violation. First of all, there's one that the FAA can't waive because it's in statute. It's in the 2016 FAA reauthorization. And that's for flying a drone recklessly in an unsafe manner over firefighting, law enforcement, or critical infrastructure. You get hit with $20,000 per violation per day for that, and the FAA can't waive it if it finds a problem. The other fines are set up in kind of a tiered system. It's a little different than those of you familiar with communications fines. It depends on the size of the entity or who's fined. For individuals operating as an airman, the maximum fine is $1,437 per violation per day. For small businesses, and they use an SBA categorization for that, the maximum fine is $13,066, again, per violation per day. And for large businesses, the maximum fine is $32,666 per violation per day, which means that those can accumulate. If you have multiple flights in a day, you can be hit with multiple fines. If you have a problem that goes on over time, say a maintenance or inspection issue, those can accumulate over time. But so far, none of them are public, and we aren't seeing large fines.
Well, let me ask some practical questions. John, what kind of equipment do you fly, and what kind of training do your pilots have?
Sure. So we fly a number of different aircraft at Measure. The aircraft that we have in common with Jeff is the Inspire 2, which is manufactured by a company called DJI. It's an off-the-shelf drone, but it provides very good images. Jeff, what does a package cost for you, all in?
The drone itself is about $5,000. That doesn't include our broadcast bonded cellular and safety equipment and everything
But
else.
by the time you walk away with a live view or a bonded device, it tends to be about 15 to 20, somewhere in there.
Our kit is a little higher. We have a bunch of safety equipment and
Okay.
include the training. So yeah, you're talking 20 something.
Well,
And are you
when you
including
include-
insurance, you said, in that?
No,
No.
so not baking in insurance or training, just talking equipment. But actually, Ann, to your point, I was in Miami last weekend, and we were doing a night operation. We had invited FAA inspectors to observe, and so a team from the local FAA office came out, and they were standing next to us on a beach in Miami Beach, watching us fly our drone, and all of a sudden, a set of green and red lights zipped by about 15 feet in front of our face, and one of them looked at me and said, "Is that yours?" I said,
No.
"No." And they said, "Well, whose was it?" I said, "I don't know, but those guys over there look like they're huddled around something." And so they kind of trudged down the beach. Took about 20 minutes. You saw somebody hanging their head in shame. Then the inspectors came back, and we said, "Well, what happened?" They said, "Well, it would be about $130,000 if we were in a bad mood."
Woo.
There you go.
But to Ann's point, it's really education then enforcement. So they were in a good mood, lucky for this guy. And it was at night. It was on a beach. He was flying over people. I can't
Multiple
remember.
violations there.
Yeah, and he racked them up pretty quickly. But it is real stuff.
Jeff, what does your training involve?
All of our pilots, and this is a self-imposed training not required by the FAA, all of our pilots go to an FAA designated test site, of which there are half a dozen across the country. We happen to use Virginia Tech. They have a great aviation program. We train news photographers, so they go and spend 3 days there, and they fly the same equipment that we have, standing next to instructors, and they do full 8 hours of class work, learn how to read air charts, all about crew resource management, flight characteristics,
Weather is the hardest for me to figure out.
weather, reading a METAR. I mean, it's a good portion of the way toward a private pilot's license. This Part 107 Remote Pilot Airman Certificate test is not easy. If you don't have an aviation background, it's difficult stuff.
But the one thing that surprised some people is it's a written test. You study for it, you take the test. There's no hands-on testing component like there is to get your Part 61 or manned pilot's license. And I think that surprised some people in the industry. And then the main unmanned trade association is kind of working on that to kind of develop ways to work with Part 61 pilots to make them know that there are training resources available, that they're beginning to promote that among unmanned pilots.
I was going to say, they say it's easier to get a boating license in or it's easier to get a Part 107 to fly a drone than it is to get a boating license in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
I passed it, so this is easy.
A couple of things we might learn in training, which are pretty critical. If there's manned aviation, we give way per the rules. Plus, it's just smart because it's safe. So think medevac helicopter coming to the ground at a news scene. We hear a helicopter. Our second person who's operating, we only operate with 2 pilots, a pilot and a visual observer / camera operator. If we hear a helicopter, the camera operator stops what he's doing and identifies it as a threat or not, a problem, and if it is, rapid descent maneuver. How quickly and safely can we get out of the way? So that's the kind of thing they might train at Virginia Tech. Go up to 400 feet and see how fast you can bring it down in a really confined area with an instructor showing you how to do that.
But still, these things are.
Can I go on? That
Go
VO,
ahead.
that visual observer is not required under the rules. Under the old Section 333 authorizations, you had to have a VO, but Sinclair is putting an extra person out there that they aren't required to put out. And talk about the vests for a minute. I love the vests. Those were a requirement early on under 333 in flights over people.
The vests simply say, drone pilot, do not distract on the back. It serves a few purposes. You know, we're standing out there in the sidewalk and members of the public are curious. They come up, what's going on? What are you doing? And all you have to do is turn your back and point, and they go, oh, sorry, and they back off, and you can go ahead. Or you say, I'll talk to you when I land. But the vests really help with that. We had a police officer tell us the other day at one of our operations, we knew you guys weren't some yahoos. We saw the vests from way far away. The other thing that's really helpful, we have these community outreach meetings at each market that we launch in prior to launching, and we invite the medevac helicopter pilots from the local hospitals, and they say, how can we see you? And we say, we're going to be wearing these vests, and we have this big 5-foot orange disc on the ground where we launch from. So we're,
And you probably have anti-collision lighting too, right, on your drones?
if we fly in that civil twilight, we do, absolutely.
But still, as a person, I don't like the idea of people flying over my head with these things, frankly. They're 55 pounds fully loaded, correct? So
They can be.
how
They
are
can
we
Not
gonna
the
get-
news media ones.
Generally,
Ours
the
are
ones that,
8.
How much?
yeah.
8 pounds.
8 pounds, still potentially deadly,
Serious.
or damage. So how are you going to get past, I think this is the big one, a very big one, the flying over people one. How are you going to get anybody, the FAA, to authorize flying over crowds? What can you do technologically to make that acceptable?
Well, the only waivers
and-
that have been granted to date for this type of thing have been closed sets. You can fly over a closed set where everyone's consented to be flown over. They've required tethering. A lot of the flights over people waivers have involved a tethered craft, and they've also involved very small craft. We were talking about one only weighs 1.37 pounds. So again, they're FAA ways they're trying to get around it, but technologically?
I would say by the time you have to put a camera in the air. That's what we're all here for. By the time you put an aircraft and a camera in the air, the camera that you can put on it at this point under that rule set is so insignificant, it's almost not worth broadcasting. It certainly takes a lot of time, effort, cost, and research to develop that. I think as the rules develop, then it becomes more worthwhile for broadcasters to look into that.
Right, so the small 1.3 camera or drone is not really fits the bill for what we need. So we're talking risk mitigation, and we need a little bit more advancement in technology, which is coming very quickly. Think something that makes an 8-pound drone safe. Bubble wrap it, put a parachute on it. Think of something, and that's what a lot of people are putting a lot of effort into.
Yeah,
so-
I'm trying to develop a frangible craft. one
Yeah,
that just
fran-
completely falls apart on impact.
Frangible.
It just breaks up?
Yeah, and that's what one of these drones does that's out right now. Years ago, I was involved in the development of a 4.4-pound aircraft that had a license band transmitter, 2 parachutes, and frangible design, and that was deemed at the time not acceptable. And the FAA has since, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the FAA has since taken a stance on parachutes that they're not really up to snuff.
Right. Tethered is okay. Parachutes are
Yeah.
not really risk mitigation yet. And for news media, this is not as big a problem. I represent some companies involved in trying to get involved in compensated package delivery, and those craft are much larger. So I think we'll see solutions for this industry before some of my other clients see solutions.
One other topic I want to, another one that bothers me personally is the privacy issue. Let's say you solve all these problems. We have break-up drones, and we can start flying them over people. What's the situation with the privacy? I know there's pushback there too, right?
Well, knock on wood, 2017 has been relatively quiet in the privacy front compared to what we saw in earlier years. In 2016, NTIA developed best practices on the privacy front. Those don't apply to news media. There's a First Amendment issue, but that really has quieted a lot of the debate from privacy advocates. Also, the ACLU was involved very early on when I started this 6 years ago. But we kind of solve the Fourth Amendment problem and the use of law enforcement drone information in proceedings. And so the ACLU kind of nationally backed off. Where we do, I don't see really an issue at the federal level right now. Where we do see it is state and local. You've still got very well-meaning legislators or city council people who want to respond to their neighbor's concern about the drone over the swimming pool. The good trend I've seen in state regulation in the last year is that more and more states are developing a statewide law that preempts local regulation of drones. And that's a good thing, again, in terms of getting rid of the patchwork quilt. If only the state can do it, we've made a lot of progress instead of having 50 municipalities in a particular state thinking about privacy regulation. In terms of privacy regulation adopted laws at the state level, there are still a few on the books that are difficult to get around. These guys may need to take them into account when they're flying. And you've always got privacy tort litigation. I mean, no matter what the statute says, no matter what the regulations say at the state and local level, I mean, there's the potential for privacy lawsuits the way there is in traditional journalism and traditional news coverage.
That being said, on a very, very practical level, whenever anyone asks me about the privacy issue and says, shouldn't we ban drones for privacy, shouldn't we do X, I tell them that if we're going to do that, then we should ban Nikon and Canon from making lenses.
Or I hold
That
up
we
my
should-
cell phone. I
Yeah.
just say your cell phone invades your privacy
That
more
we
than a
should get
drone
rid of
ever
all
does.
iPads,
Let's
cell
ban
phones,
them all.
and tablets. Yeah,
we have
exactly.
we have a question out there. We have got more experience in this panel with on the drone front than you're likely to get in one place. Glenn?
Glenn Dixon with TVNewsCheck. Question for Jeff. That station out in Reno, is that a station that has a helicopter at its disposal?
No, but we do have some stations that have helicopters as well.
Because that's what I'm curious about. Have you been able to, helicopters are obviously very expensive for mid and small market stations. How many stations do you have that now can do aerial shots where they previously didn't have that because they didn't have a helicopter? Or have you been able to replace helicopters in any stations with your drone program?
So, first of all, we have 34 stations that are using drones right now. I think of these as two different use cases. A helicopter can get somewhere quickly where in a drone you still have to drive there to put it up. So a helicopter can respond quickly and show the accident on the highway that just happened or the fire. The drone can take a better picture of it, but it takes longer to get there. And the drone can fly low and near people, think 50 feet off the ground without blowing everyone away. A helicopter could never do that safely at a low altitude anyway. So it's two different use cases. We're not necessarily replacing helicopters because, think a whole morning show wants traffic for that market. That's probably a good thing that's going to continue. But the drones are an additional type of video.
One more question. Way in the back there. Oh, right here. I'm sorry.
Hi, Fletcher Fisher, IBW New England. Some of our stations that we represent train their own photogs to do the drones, and some of the stations are subcontracting to an independent company. The question I have is, if a video is shot over people and something happens, is the station liable if they use it on air, or is it just a subcontractor?
And why don't you take the first part of that?
It's no different than liability from a video shot on the ground. It's classic tort law. You're first going to look at negligence, what was the cause, and then you're going to look at respondeat superior, who was in charge, who was at fault. There's nothing different, I don't think, in this drone context than there is in terms of you're going out and what you've been filming every day for years.
I would say, though, for stations like that, for customers like that, in addition to our sort of bespoke, what we call white glove service at Measure, we also do an out-of-house training program like Jeff has, where we cover all the topics. And for example, I know that somebody at our last training program for KPRC had the same question. And so that's something that's covered in one of the programs that we run.
And in terms of insurance, I mean, there are a lot of insurance products that are developing specifically for drones at this point, and you just want to make sure that whatever insurance you have does cover that. It's not, a legal requirement, but make sure your insurance is comprehensive.
I'm afraid
And
our
from
time. Well, go ahead. One more quick comment.
Yep. I was just saying, from a news aspect, we have to judge whether we want to use that video. Is it someone shot something with a cell phone that's inappropriate? This is now like that. If we see that drone video is obviously illegal, we're probably not going to use it, even though it has impact.
Well, our time is up, and I want you to join me in thanking John, Jeff, and Ann